Please feel free. This is a safe space and we would not want anybody to be discriminated against or harassed in any way. And obviously, it's very easy to misinterpret what people say. Colonialism, repatriation, and reparation discussions can escalate. So we're asking you to be very mindful as you engage in conversations with our participants, with each other, in how you address issues. And we ask then that you find the most generous language that you could possibly use to engage with each other. Of course, we want to exchange ideas, but as we exchange ideas, do so respectfully. And we're thanking you from the bottom of our heart once again for joining us. We would also like to thank our partners and supporters in this initiative that would not have happened if it wasn't for their support. The Museums Lab, which we were a part of in 2022, and we all met there, the Goethe Institute in Kenya, and would also like to give a special mention to Savvy Contemporary in Berlin that have been supporting us all the way through. And everybody else, you know, who we can't mention behind the scenes, the technical support, who have been so encouraging and so supportive. And just to give a little background on the group, the Disrupting and Reorienting Restitution, we are a new collective, you know, brand new, and we're a group of the Museums Lab 2022. We consist of about 13 from Europe and Africa working together. We aim to disrupt and reorient the conversation around restitution and repatriation. And we also particularly want to amplify the voices that are not heard from Africa and the diaspora, and of course in Europe as well. We also just wanted to mention as we started this journey, because obviously we've been talking about it for almost a year now, 8 months perhaps since we left the Museums Lab, about what we want to do. So we're very much about using digital platforms and social to discuss and voice our opinions. So when we started this journey, our obvious first place was Instagram. And surprisingly, we came up against some resistance and we were shut down twice, even though there was no visible violation that we committed. We're also very aware that in the discourse of restitution, there's a lot of silencing and resistance, but we refuse to keep quiet and continue to occupy the space. We thought it was important that we should mention that. And a bit on our event, we brainstormed over a couple of months what we had wanted to do. And Unforbidden Knowledge came about in terms of a 3-part event that we put together as a collective to examine and unpack objects taken from their source communities to European museums that were forbidden from use. That was really important to us. So this event is to unpack these artifacts in collaboration with community members, scholars, and our resident artist, Mihayo Kallaye, whom you'll meet in a few seconds. We had our first part last week. In case you missed it, it's on our YouTube. We'll give the information in the chat. And we focused on the Makishi mask in the National Museums of World Culture in Sweden. Our resident artist is going through a process of creating an eventual art piece as a way of creating new understanding and meaning of the objects that we'll be looking at. He will also be part of an artist talk as the final part of this event on 1st November. So please save the date. And now I'll be handing over to Hebla Abdelgawed, a member of our collective who will be moderating the conversation. So thank you once again and enjoy.
Thank you so much, Samba, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm absolutely thrilled to be in the company of two of, including Mihayo, of course, but two of my very dear friends and colleagues. Today we'll be discussing museums, not only Western European museums, but equally African museums, and looking into how we can introduce or perhaps raise questions on what is needed to introduce indigenous methodologies and indigenous ways of doing, seeing, and being within the museum space. Museums, sadly, particularly museums hosting African collections, they have an effect, or all museums around the world, they have an effect And this effect usually, it constructs the way not only we see ourselves as the local communities living around the museums, but how we see the other, how we see other communities too. In creating or in constructing an image of the other, this can produce stereotypes and stigmas if this other is represented in a way that is us versus them, which is sadly usually the case when it comes to African collections. This is what we tend to call, or what we are calling today, museum knowledge. What should have been in complementing museum knowledge, but sadly it is in conflict with museum knowledge, that is indigenous knowledge. That's the indigenous ways of being, seeing, doing, and knowing things about oneself, the environment, and just the world around everyone. However, indigenous knowledge tends to be in conflict with museum knowledge because rarely does this indigenous knowledge filter into displays, or even in something as simple as exhibition shops. You would be surprised to know that many people create their own knowledge about certain cultures through how they are sold in the exhibition shop, or through the products that you would find them in an exhibition shop. Today, I would also like to pose a question, because we would use as the center of conversation two, I would like to call them ancestral belongings, but sadly within museology, we tend to refer to them as objects, but I personally feel uncomfortable with calling them objects. But equally, us as a collective, as we were preparing this discussion, the conversation series, we were wondering what other wording we could use instead of objects. We were looking for a wording that could represent not only the interpretation or how it looks physically, but the emotional link that people make with the belongings that exist in the museum. This is an open call for everyone with us today. Please do use the chat to tell us what you think would be a better wording or phrasing, which could be more culturally contextual, but equally more culturally sensitive than the very material way of looking at things as inventories or only accession numbers within museums. Today, the two main belongings that we've got are what museums call dolls or fertility figurines. We will be discussing how has the knowledge that was created by the museum surrounding these two belongings, how did it shape many stigmas and stereotypes surrounding African collections. And I'm absolutely delighted and honored to be in conversation today with Lydia Nafula. Lydia is a researcher in the Cultural Heritage Department at the National Museums of Kenya. She is an alumni of the Museums Lab 2022. Together with other alumni, she worked on the development of the Dolls of Good Hope exhibition, which will be part of our discussion today, which is currently running at the Nairobi National Museum. She was part of the International Inventories Program, a research, exhibition, and database project that focused on Kenyan collections in Western museums. She also participated in the Museum Futures Africa project, a Pan-African people-centered cultural project that explored new formats of African museology. I'm equally in conversation with Campbell Price. Campbell is curator of Egypt and Sudan at the Manchester Museum, University of Manchester, which is one of the UK's most significant ancient Egyptian and Sudanese collections. He graduated with a BA and MA and PhD in Egyptology from the University of Liverpool, where we both met. And his research interests center on ancient interactions with images and their modern interpretation, which is mostly Eurocentric and colonial in essence. And we have our wonderful artist in residence, Mihayo Kallaye, who will also be in conversation with the three of us in an attempt to glean knowledge that he will use to inspire his artwork. Mihayo is a Tanzanian multimedia installation artist. He creates thought-provoking works that incorporate video, sound, fabric, and found objects. By exploring the post-colonial situation in Africa, delving into African history, spirituality, and politics, his installations invite audiences to engage with these complex topics. With experimental techniques like borrowing text, drawing, collages, and stitching, Kallaye's art offers unique perspectives and insights, and I think me and everyone is so looking forward to the artwork that he will produce in response to our conversation series and our project. I'll delve into the discussion straight away, and I would like to invite Lydia first. to tell us or to give us a brief description of the belonging that she chose would be the center or the focus of her discussion. If she could give us a bit of an interpretation of description of the belonging itself, which we will see an image of in the screen that would be shared with us in a minute. And perhaps tell us, Lydia, why did you choose this?
Thank you, Heba. So what you can see in the screen, on the screen is the Ikidet or Turkana doll. It's a fertility doll. And why it's sometimes referred to as the Turkana doll, it's from the Turkana people who are found at the north of Kenya, close to the southern Sudan border. So the Ikidets can be made of wood, like the photos on the left hand of the screen and on the right hand of the screen, or they can be made from doom palm seeds. So a cluster of doom palm seeds, which is on the right hand, bottom right hand of the screen is one made from doom palm seeds. So the Ikidet is made to resemble the Turkana ladies. So the way they are dressed is the traditional way the Turkana ladies dress. So they dress in they have beaded ornaments around their neck. They have necklaces. They have beaded leather skirts. And these dolls are also referred to as locally by the Turkana people as Ngideti or Ekome. They are used as fertility dolls, so by girls who are aspiring to become mothers, and also by women who maybe have not been able to conceive. And other times they're also used as toys within the community. So that's a short description of the Ikidet. Thanks.
And do you think that the museum definition for them or the interpretation that they are usually put into museums, is it aligned with how the community uses it and perceives it, or is there a contradiction between both?
So many times museums concentrate on one aspect of the dolls, so they may just consider them as fertility dolls, while there's a lot, as I've already mentioned, they reflect the Turkana people, the way they dress, their lifestyle, and various people within the community, not just various rituals and customs related to the doll, so not just the aspect of fertility.
And are the aspect or definition of them as dolls, do you think, could it be, because for example, for me, it's something, because I would see a doll as a toy, but they are far more than toys. Is calling them toys take away from their meaning or condescending in reference to them, or would they be referred to as toys within the community as well? They are used as toys within the community as well.
So that's just one aspect of what they are. So the children also use them as toys, but they are more than just toys. They're used in rituals and various customary ceremonies. So when you just refer them as a doll, yes, they are, but that's just one aspect of what they are. So ordinarily, the people will go beyond just the use as a toy and go towards the other aspects as being a fertility doll and using them in various rituals.
Yeah, because I think many examples of it does exist in Western museums, right? Similar examples, not particularly this toy, or similar examples would exist in Western museums outside of Kenya.
Yes, that's true. For example, we have the Vigango, which are found among the coastal communities in Kenya. So many people from museums or the early collectors who came by, they looked at them as art objects, while they are sacred objects used among the community members around the within the coast. So they are put up after one has passed on, and in shrines. Well, because of their appearance, that takes that of a community member, they're well carved. So many people have mistaken them as art objects. While for the community, they consider them sacred objects that are not meant to be like out there just being used for any other thing, like maybe just in one's home. So for them to be even in a museum, they're meant to be various rituals conducted before they're put up in that space. But that's not actually the ideal space for the vigango, which I also refer to as memorial posts or grave posts. Yeah.
And is it, and correct me if I'm wrong, are they, when they are displayed in Nairobi, are they displayed in a more contextual manner that is closer to how they are perceived in the indigenous community, or do you adopt similar Western methodologies in displaying the objects?
So, okay, museology is a Western concept, so there's a lot of that within it, but we try to put them in context. So we have some vigango within the Nairobi National Museum. So apart from putting them up in a normal museum way, we also have a photo reflecting how they would appear within the community. So the way they would appear in a shrine. So you see a photo of a shrine and the vigango put up, and the way they would be treated by the community members. So the rituals related to the sacredness of the object, the way the people go about it, providing libation for the vigango. Yeah, so there's more to it than just putting the object there out of context. So we try to provide a context for the object, or for the vigango for that matter.
Thank you, Lydia. And I'll be inviting Campbell as well to showcase the figurine that he has chosen for us, and the slide of which will be coming up just now, shared with us. Yes, here we go. So Campbell, would you like to tell us more about your chosen belonging and why did you choose this particular figurine?
Thank you, Heba. Thank you for the introduction. It's great to be here. Unlike Lydia's description of a belonging, this is a very ancient piece. This is perhaps almost 4,000 years old. So unlike the belongings that Lydia was describing, we can't ask simply a living community, because like any archaeological material, it comes from a long time ago, and the people are no longer, the community in which this item was situated, that belonged to people that someone took great pride in making. You can't go and ask them. And so I think the issue with Egyptology in general, as you know, Heba, is that people put in new interpretations, their own interpretations. We bring our own ideas, concepts, prejudices to things because we feel we can't ask someone in the everyday today. And inevitably, that's been a colonial way of viewing almost exclusively for a lot of ancient Egyptian material. So what you're looking at belonged to someone. It's a belonging. It sits in your hand, this figurine of a lady. It comes from the south of Egypt, a place today known as Luxor. Archaeologically, it's called Thebes, West Bank of Thebes. And it was found with another group of objects. So there's an interesting archaeological context. Those other objects are associated with magic. And immediately I mentioned the word magic. A lot of people, visitors to Manchester Museum, where this figurine is displayed, associate magic with Harry Potter and, you know, fantasy, and in a way it can be a very dismissive term. So once you talk about magic, things aren't very serious. And you already mentioned this, Heba. these belongings have been described as dolls, and whether they were actually used as what we might think of as dolls is debatable. But using the term with the implication of a child's toy is pretty dismissive. And I think it's true of a lot of pre or non-Christian material in Western museums that these things are thought of as childish. So it looks like something a child could play with. My own personal opinion as an Egyptologist is that this was a very serious object used by adults and perhaps only owned or interacted with relatively few people. So in thinking about the general theme of today, I think this figurine does represent restricted knowledge, forbidden knowledge perhaps. So not everyone had one. It wasn't something that just sat around the house like a child's toy might do today. It was invested with very serious meaning and power, which is very difficult to communicate nowadays in a Western museum like Manchester, much though we might try. So I'm rambling on just a bit. So in terms of description, it represents a naked woman. It's broken, and in common with other belongings of this type, there's a question over whether these figurines were deliberately broken as a way of altering or changing or stopping or containing their power. It represents sexuality. And I think for the people who first interacted with these objects in modern times, that's the late 19th century, middle upper class white men, it was something intimidating, it was something threatening. And it was immediately typologized, and maybe we'll come back to this. So it was given a kind of place in a set of objects. And as Heba already mentioned, giving something a number, you can see the number on the right-hand image. It has the number 1787. So that is the Manchester Museum number. For anyone familiar with the museum system, you can tell that probably means it comes from this site in Western Thebes, but it really is reductive. It takes its power and it changes it into being just another thing in a series of things. Its original function, much debated. The general Egyptological consensus is that this represents something to do with fertility. You don't really get comparable male figurines with naked men, but that's not to say this object necessarily was just something used by or for women. One key point about it, which maybe we can come back to, which I really want to highlight, is one useful word maybe in modern Egyptology that's been applied to this belonging is that it is truncated. Although it was broken, maybe in the archaeological excavation or maybe accidentally over thousands of years, or maybe deliberately in ancient times, it never had any lower legs. It was made to have truncated, shortened legs. And so the initial interpretation was either that it was a child's toy, which can be quite dismissive, or early interpretation was that it was a concubine for the dead, assuming that the dead person was male, and that this was a sexual object to give sexual gratification to the tomb owner in the afterlife. And the lack of lower legs was interpreted to mean this prevented the ability from this woman from running away. The reality, I suspect, is much more complicated, but this is just two sets of observations that have been made in a modern museum setting. One last observation I'll make is you can maybe just about make out around the waist of the figure, there's indication of dots. And so in other figurines of this type, you will see more elaborate cowrie shell jewelry, a cowrie shell belt. And this is known from other contexts in pharaonic imagery to represent sexuality, to represent pleasure, to represent divinity. And it's something I'm quite interested in, modern Western ideas of this is a woman, this is a man, this is a person, this is a god, this is a divinity, seem to be blurred in the reality of ancient experience. So I'll stop there, Heba. Sorry for going on.
No, not at all. That's brilliant. Campbell, I think you would know that I would be asking this question anyway, but you started by saying that there is currently no community to check with if this is how this was used. Which brings me to the conception of how the museum knowledge defines, for example, Egypt is the place apart. Egypt is never displayed within African collections. It's solely in ancient Egyptian. There is an ancient Egyptian department and there is the African collection. Yeah. The African collection is usually within an anthropological ethnographic framing as well, given the colonial gaze to it, or world cultures. While Egypt is just ancient Egypt by itself, or the Orient, if we're speaking of in Germany or in other Northern European settings. How do you, as a museum curator today, do you see us Egyptians as indigenous? Do you see any value of adopting indigenous Egyptian knowledge? Because we've got similar currently within the community. We've got similar rituals and similar behaviors, including magic as well, even although which goes against Coptic religion or Islamic religion, which are the main dominant religions, but we still have our own cultural beliefs surrounding magic, fertility, and using figurines that are more or less similar to this. How do you, as a museum curator, feel about this?
Sure. I should, of course, clarify that in describing the statement, there are no living people to ask. I should say that that's kind of standard museum perception, exactly, yeah. And it may not be one I personally hold, because Heba, I know you and I have discussed this, that people living in Egypt today are counted generally not as indigenous from a museum perspective, because you have, exactly as you said, Heba, a department at Manchester Museum called Living Cultures, and by definition, anything else is a dead culture. So there's this colonial divide that says anything before now is dead, and the people living in Egypt are somehow, in this vision, fundamentally different from the ancient people. My personal experience has been enriched greatly by speaking to living people like yourself, Heba, who are Egyptian and who live in Egypt and who have, shall I say, a much deeper and more fundamental knowledge of the belongings of their ancestors than necessarily Western museum curators. So I want to be clear on that point. Generally, and perhaps also to flag up work by my colleagues at Manchester Museum, we are one of the few museums in the UK that has a curator of Indigenous perspectives, Alexandra Alberta, and she and I have discussed things like identity and naming, which I don't mind saying, as a traditionally trained Egyptologist, have transformed my understandings of how identity is observed in belongings. And I should also say, why is this object this belonging that we're talking about now in Manchester? Of course, it didn't just drop out of the sky. It wasn't discovered in Manchester. It is there precisely because of the colonial project. The group of items that I described, the so-called Ramesseum tomb group, was moved out of Egypt, exported as part of a colonial system of fines division, which notionally said that the best things stayed in Cairo and things that were thought to be surplus to requirements would be sent out elsewhere. And I know Heba and other colleagues have done really important work on this dissemination of material. These objects were thought of as a group. This group of belonging was understood as a group, and none of them, as far as I'm aware, stayed in Egypt. They were all exported. So this is very much a result of colonial extraction. That's all I wanted to say on that point.
No, that's true. And going back to Lydia's choice of belonging today and Campbell's choice, if we have the image that shows them together, they both existed initially within a community setting that is far different than a glass museum showcase. And a glass museum showcase shaped how they are seen, but it equally shaped how the communities where these belongings come from are seen today, the modern communities, either in the sense of being totally orphaned, totally non-indigenous, as in the case of Egyptian, or as in indigenous, as in the case with Kenya. But Lydia, to what extent do you think that the Kenyan indigenous knowledge surrounding it has been banned or forbidden from a museum space? And what do you think could be done about that? What have been lost?
So I'll go back to the colonial times. So for this particular community, the Turkana, many of these objects are the way what is reflected in the Ikidet is quite common, but you find in many communities also because of the location where the Turkana are. So there's a less interaction with the colonialists. But for many other communities, when the colonialists came in, they made the people feel that whatever they have, their culture and all is very negative. Maybe as I mentioned before, witchcraft, considered maybe witchcraft, and also they were encouraged to forget about these rituals or these items they used, because being thought of as negative. So many of these people stopped using some of these items and adopted maybe some Western aspects. So much of these cultural aspects were lost. And while these colonialists were encouraging them to forget about these belongings of theirs, they would carry them to the Western world. So many of them now are in the Western museums, and much of this knowledge has now been lost. So the only place where you can learn about this or know that they existed are in some of these Western museums. And the current generation have no idea of the existence of these cultural items. And now some people are trying to learn more about them, and it's quite hard to reclaim the past. There's that gap of many centuries and many years. Yeah, that's what I can see for now.
So here we've got an example where the museum knowledge has been actually harmful, in the sense it led to loss of cultural beliefs and traditions where the communities themselves are seeing as uncivilized, because again, certain parts of the world and their museums have adopted this notion or this concept of civilized and uncivilized. Anything that is in the global north side of the world is civilized, where everything else that doesn't conform with the global north ways of seeing things at the colonial time is perceived as uncivilized. So knowledge is evidently lost. If we, for example, try to think of because in both belongings here, one which is the Egyptian one rests in Manchester, and the Ekidat which rests in Kenya, is there a way to retract the harm or the forbidden knowledge that has been imposed on them? Is there a way that we reflect, for example, indigenous feminism? Could it be a counter narrative? How do you think we can create a counter narrative surrounding these belongings today?
So one of the ways to do this is for those who have lost their knowledge is to get information to reorient themselves to their culture and all. And for those who have seen like their culture is negative, is to encourage them that what they have is quite rich and very important. It's part of who they are and what their future entails. And yeah, that's part of what they could see. And also, for some of these items, they are just or belongings. They are associated with certain members of the community, and yet they were used by all members of the community. So to attribute them to the right people in the community and to the rituals and ceremonies that are related to them. So even in where they are, the information should be corrected to reflect what the community think about them.
Campbell, what do you think?
Oh gosh, well, first and foremost, with something like the figurine I was talking about, just acknowledging the colonial extraction of hundreds of thousands of objects like that figurine would be one way to just maybe not to bring some sense of justice, because it's interesting with pharaonic material culture especially, it's thought of as world heritage. Everyone likes ancient Egypt, but it belongs to everyone except people who happen to be Egyptian and live in Egypt today. I think there is a broader question about knowledge production. So yeah, you can place something like the figurine in a display case and publish photographs of it and try and make it accessible to a wide audience. But still, you've already created archives about the excavation, which was done almost exclusively by Egyptian men, women, and children, and who are hardly acknowledged in the official history of archaeology in Egypt. But then the belongings of ancient people are then immediately considered part of an academic discourse, so a part of Egyptology, and that is immediately restrictive. That then becomes really about people who have access to books and discussions about the meaning of these things. All of that becomes something that just happens in the pages of books and journals. How to correct this? Well, I think there's something also about modern museum software, which needs to expand its understanding of description of what is worth recording. And it's something we've talked about at Manchester, where the use of items, of belongings, needs to be part of the history and the account of things that museums talk about as objects. And I think this could equally be true for ancient objects as for objects, belongings which are used in modern settings.
This takes us to reflecting on how the museum as a structure, as an institution, not only in its displays, but even in its databases, in the way it defines certain belongings, then it defines certain more modern communities as well. So this restriction of knowledge and this forbidding of certain knowledge does develop stereotypes and stigmas regarding certain modern communities, as in the case of, for example, Egypt, where they are not perceived as indigenous altogether, or as in the case of Lydia, where their beliefs is considered as unprogressive or perhaps something negative that they should totally abolish. Reflecting on this, I think we've got a good example from the exhibition of Good Hope that Lydia has curated recently, which was on the very same topic that we're discussing, the topic of dolls or fertility figurines. And I wonder if Lydia would like to tell us more about this experience and perhaps more the opportunities that this has led to, but equally maybe the setbacks, what has been very problematic to push against when preparing this exhibition, in terms of interpretation, of course.
So the Dolls of Good Hope is an exhibition where a number of M-Lab or Museum Lab alumni collaborated to come up with the exhibition. So we're from different countries within Africa, and two of us were from Germany. So within Africa, though, from all the regions, there was some representative from all the regions. So West Africa, North Africa, Eastern Central Africa, and Southern Africa. So the name itself is reflects what is represented in the exhibition. So Dolls of Good Hope. So positive or enriching aspects about dolls. So the dolls, coincidentally, majority of the dolls were fertility or falling into the generalization fertility, because they could also have other uses. Then we had rainmaking dolls, we had remembrance dolls, and we had healing dolls. So we had a healing doll which is both in Sudan and Egypt. We had a doll from Egypt, which is a paddle doll. We had fertility doll from Ghana, Akuaba. Fertility doll from Kenya. Fertility dolls from Kenya, one of them is the Ikidet, which I mentioned, and another one from the Samburu community. Then we had a rainmaking doll also from Kenya. Then we also had Cameroon represented, although there was no alumni from Cameroon, because we've been using an image from Cameroon, the Namji doll. So we decided also to have the Namji doll within the exhibition. And then from Zimbabwe, had a fertility doll from Zimbabwe also. Actually, the one from Zimbabwe is, let me say, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Kenya, Ghana, originally from Ghana, Ashanti doll, but now many countries have adopted it in various forms. So it's also a fertility doll. And we had from Namibia, we had a remembrance doll from the Nama people or the Herero people. So it was representing the colonial period when the people, the Nama people, were exterminated by the German colonialists. So remembering that time when there was an uprising and the Germans went against the Nama people. So it's both a remembrance, remembering that time so that people cannot repeat such incidences, and also representing the people, the Nama people themselves, and the Abaherero people, their dress, the way they dress, especially the headgear, which represents the cattle they wear. So it has like two pointed parts of the headscarf at the front, which represents the cattle of the Nama people. So the exhibition was, as I told you, from people, alumni from various parts of the continent, and also Europe. So dolls are common in all cultures. So not just in Africa, but here we were really championing the African doll, because many of the African children have their adult relatives and their other relatives have left the use of the African doll and thinking everything Western is the best. So we are championing the use of the African dolls, the beauty of the African doll, the richness of the culture reflected in the African doll. So many of these are represented in the exhibition, and the various uses, materials. Yeah, so for now, I'll leave it at that. We can go on and on about the exhibition.
Yeah, so I guess in representing a variety or the wide selection of African dolls, if that's the preferred terminology, that was in itself, in a way, an anti-colonial act in perhaps encouraging younger children or younger generation to use African dolls more, rather than thinking that Western dolls are just better than African dolls. And this takes us to how also the fact that an anti-colonial approach is useful in solving even problems that exist in the global north. For example, in the case of the Egyptian figurines, they are usually referred to as fertility figurines, which in a way it's a bit downgrading for women, because that seems to be like the only role that the museum tells us about them in the ancient time. So in perhaps showcasing a counter narrative to this, or an indigenous feminist counter narrative to this, Campbell, what do you think this can offer us, or this can help resolve in the modern community, not only in the indigenous community, but worldwide?
Yeah, I think this is a real opportunity to, correct a really lazy set of interpretations. So you have something, a piece of writing or a display on Egyptian women, and these figurines might appear on the assumption that, as I said, they're exclusively made by or for women, which is not the case, actually. Even archaeologically speaking, they are attested in domestic settings, in tombs and temples. Nowhere does it say these were exclusively the preserve of women. And it is a problem in the global north, an ongoing problem about how cultures are pigeonholed, about how individual parts of societies are expected to behave in the ancient past, in the modern world as well. And one, just as Lydia was talking, I was thinking about the exhibition about the Dolls of Good Hope. One powerful way of challenging the colonial perception in Egypt that because the majority religion is different, because Islam is the majority religion in Egypt now, somehow the people are fundamentally different to their ancestors. One way would be to track the use in material culture of figurines, which are attested from other times. It's not like ancient, there's a huge gap between ancient times and modern times. It's simply that collecting practices have not favored the intervening Christian and Islamic periods. So there could be an interesting history of use of figurines from different parts of Africa, including Egypt, from ancient times to today, which would challenge that notion. But the glamour, the appeal, the sexiness of ancient Egypt is persistent. And I use that word sexiness deliberately because in some ways, these so-called fertility figurines do fulfill this colonial Orientalist vision of what ancient Egyptian women, more modern Egyptian women are like. And that is a very, very difficult set of assumptions to shift.
Yes, exactly. And that does have an impact on us women daily lives.
Yeah.
I guess in creating stigmas, or the way the society perceives us or misperceives us or don't perceive us whatsoever. I would like now to invite Mihayo, who might have a set of questions or interesting conversation to have with all of you.
Hello, everybody.
Hey.
As Eva said, my name is Mihayo. I'm a multimedia artist based in Dar es Salaam, and I'm an artist in residence. And this program around the forbidden knowledge, which is very interesting for me, is one of the effort of decolonizing Africa, decolonization. And if I can reflect a bit in this conversation that we have had, it's very interesting how both of us as Africans, regarding around these materials, we're very connected because this story is very similar also with what I have here in Tanzania. And along my journey in this residence, I'm constantly comparing and making comparison with what we have here in Tanzania, so that I can have a really good grasp of what we are, what discussions we have. And I have a few questions. And for both of you, Lydia and Campbell and Heba. Okay, I'll start with this question. This goes to both Heba and Campbell. Because for me, I'm very interested with the knowledge around these materials, especially to the community, the local community. And today is very interesting that we are thinking around on how to bring into the museum this indigenous knowledge. So that's very interesting. But I wanted also to know, like, I've seen these sacred objects, the way they've been made, but is there any spiritual reason for the selections of these materials to make these objects? And another question is, who was allowed to make these objects? Is it everybody, or there was some people who were like, these are the people who should make these objects? And another question, maybe this goes to Lydia, because Campbell talked about it when he was talking about the object from Egypt, is about the ownership. Who was allowed to own this fertility sacred object from Kenya, the Ikidet? Like, was it for everybody? And also wanted also to think about, like, in current society, it has evolved a lot that even kids can have it as a doll and everything. And how are we navigating through this situation to bring conversation of restitution to the public? And another question, this goes to Heba and Campbell, because it was very interesting, like how the world is structuring us to think, like those ancient Egyptian and there's this Egypt now. And actually, I'm telling you, even myself from Tanzania, I'm very confused. But it's because of also this colonial narrative, like, oh my God, it's too much. But I just want to know, like, in the education system in Egypt, if you guys got studied there and grew up there, what from the history part, what is it telling you on your origin? So yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, Mihayo. They are really good questions here. But if I could jump in just on the subject of materials, because I think this is interesting.
Yeah, go for
I
it.
didn't
Yes,
mention this.
Yeah, that's what I thought when he asked. Good, well spotted, Mihayo.
I should have said at the very beginning in a description that the figurine, so-called fertility figurine I showed, is made of this very distinctive greenish, bluish, glazed material called faience. Oh, thank you. It's called faience, and it comes in this very striking set of colors. And I was thinking before this meeting, you know, if you were the person making this, it would be something quite special. It would be something quite supernatural, because you're mixing clay and a kind of glazing material, essentially quartz from sand, and then a coloring agent made from a kind of copper compound. So if you fire this material, you make your shape and you fire it, it kind of sweats the glaze. The glaze isn't all the way through, the glaze kind of migrates to the surface. And it must have been, you know, a really interesting transformation from something, you know, clay colored to something bright green or bright blue. And I think that must have had a significance to the ancient people who were making items and who were interacting and using those things. And I really wonder, to follow up on that question, Mihayo, about the artisans, the people who are making uh, this material. They're using this material. I don't think it's everybody. I don't think everyone goes back, somewhere in their house and has a kiln to make these. I think the people who were making them were ritual specialists, and I think they would have had to have been trained, and they would have known they were doing something special. The ancient Egyptian word, incidentally, for this material, what we call faience in Egyptology now, was chechenet, which in English means dazzling. So you could imagine it's like this really superhuman, special material. So yeah, I think not everyone could make them. I think that was quite a restricted special thing. And I guess the knowledge of how to do it would be restricted, would be a sort of forbidden knowledge. So this is something you don't get in a modern museum setting where we're used to mass-produced ceramics with glaze. It's easy. But in the ancient world and in different parts of the world now, different materials just have this added value, which I think is lost in a glass case. I think there was a second part about experiences of knowing in Egypt today, which Heba is better to answer. But one point I just wanted to say about curatorial expertise, it's something my colleague, the curator of living cultures at Manchester Museum, who's also a museum lab alumnus as of this year, and Dr. Njibulu Chipengura and I have discussed, a lot of this is about letting go for curators, for people who work in museums, to really let go and to not be anxious about having the answer to what something is or how it was used. I think that's really important. And I'm happy, of course, to share these kind of stories with anyone who visits Manchester Museum or who wants to know. But we know that there are community groups all around the world and in Egypt now that could tell a more compelling story about how museum objects were used. I'll shut up, Heba, sorry.
That was good.
Oh, you don't have to shut up.
And also how you're explaining like how they used to do, there's a lot of science. I don't know
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's science, yeah, absolutely.
A lot of science, So yeah, that's very, very interesting.
Yeah, I think it's an aspect, Campbell, that we tend to ignore a bit. The technology that came into making of these belongings, be it in Egypt or in Kenya, there was a technology. This is what could be referred to from an indigenous perspective as well as technology. But again, it's the Eurocentric ways of defining what is perceived as technology and what is knowledge and what is not, is what made up all these colonial framings. I think for me to answer your question, Mihayo, I can only think of how, if I were living in ancient Egypt at the time, I don't think I would have afforded having having a belonging like this, because this was restricted to the elite, and I'm not elite as such. I wish I was, because you would have got so many privileges at the time. But it makes me always reflect of how this was touched by, this belonged to someone. That's why I tend to call them belongings. It has been touched by many hands, and I think we're very privileged to be able to retouch something that was touched 4,000 years ago, and to know that these are like my people, my ancestors. That's the way I feel. I feel emotionally touched, but equally proud. I know it's not very academic or professional, but this is why I'm saying all of these belonging come with a lot of emotional baggage, particularly if you come from the same culture. It can be frustrating to always see it behind a display showcase in a glass showcase and not to see it interacting with the community. I hope this answers the question.
Yeah, And Mrs. Lydia also, I had the same question for you on the choice of material. Was there any spiritual reason to choose the material that were used to make the ikidet?
So the ikidet, okay, because it wasn't so much spiritual, so it was more of what was found in the environment, and even the doom palm seeds. So the location where the Turkana are found is semi-arid. It's near Lake Turkana, which I had mentioned is north of the country, quite close to South Sudan. So part of the reason for the selection of one form, that's the doom palm seeds. They are natural, occurring in the environment where the Turkana are. Then another form was wooden, or is, because for the ancient Egyptians, they're talking more in the past. So for the Turkana, it's like just culture changing according to time. So the ones I'm referring to are what is like more or less currently in use or in use in the last few years. So as you can see, there's beads. So that's more recent manufactured beads. So previously they would use like ostrich eggshells. They were carved into beads. So where you see manufactured beads now then would be naturally occurring beads, so like ostrich eggshells or other forms of beads, so like seeds or wooden beads. And you had also asked about who would make these. So the women and the girls would make the ikidets, and it would be hung in the house or worn depending on the form of the ikidet, especially the one made from seeds. They would be worn on the neck or over the shoulder or around the waist, and used during ceremonies and where there would be dances. So this would also form part of the attire and sort of the daily wear. And then a successful dolls, so for those who are aspiring to have children who hadn't had children for a while, so when they would get a child, then they would hand over the doll to a female relative, like a sister, to now have the doll, or the ikidet for that matter, because doll is like a English way of referring to this item. So they would hand over the ikidet to the female relative.
That's very, very, very interesting when you say the Egyptian were talking about the past, and what you guys have in Kenya is a bit of more recent, like it's just changing because of the globalization and everything. I just want to challenge the thinking. As a person who's working in a museum in Kenya, how do you see this as an opportunity to strengthen this conversation on forbidden knowledge? Because still you have communities that are not as much as disconnected from their ancestors as most of us. How do you go around in Kenya with your experience in making a museum? How do you see this as an opportunity to even themselves, to give them confidence? Because what's happening to Africans is that we don't have confidence on our own culture, because we have been brainwashed a lot for so many years. And now it's like, we don't even know what's our culture. We're just like, okay, we need to remember this. It's not so clear. So how for you do you see this as an opportunity? You don't have to answer it anyway. You can answer it or just have it at the thinking, because I know it's very abrupt.
I think it's a good question and a good thing to think about, because for these communities who are still have this culture that is very rich, they should be encouraged to document it and to pass the knowledge to the future generations, so that later on it's not all lost and no one has any idea about it. So this is like an ideal time to do this.
Because I can also relate with the tribe that we share between Tanzania and Kenya, the Maasai. And one of the incidents that happened in Tanzania, which is very disgusting incident, I can say, because of censorship, it was not even published in our news and everything. So it's very less known by Tanzanians, is that there's this tribe, Kenya, Tanzania, we have a Maasai, and they have the place that they used to live in Ngorongoro, like from ancestors and ancestors. And just because of the very, I can say, capitalistic way of thinking of the government, they gave this place to an Arabic investor to create a space for hunting, which is very sad. And they took these people away from this area to another area completely foreign for them, to expect them to have a good life there, which is very bad. So for me, it's also something like, oh my God, the Maasai people we know, they kept their culture, they kept their practices as all these years with all this technology. But of course, as now with all this globalization, they are also being endangered, their knowledge. And also the government is even putting a lot of power to also take away them away from these ancestral inheritance. And one time, I had a conversation with a former prime minister here. I asked him, you guys took those people away from the area to another area, very foreign, very different climatic condition. You only say that you gave them land and house. This is very low way of thinking. Did you think about their monuments, their graves, the knowledge with nature? Did you think of all this? He gave me a very political answer. For me, I would just tell them at least to go to have an organization for themselves, to go to visit these lands once a year. I was like, wow, would you do that for yourself? So it's very sad it's going on now, but I just want us to think around this, like if we have few tribes are still connected to their roots, as people, as me as an artist and other professionals, how do we think around this area to keep, especially around this conversation with forbidden knowledge? How do we think? How do we see this as an opportunity? Yeah. And another question was Campbell and Heba on the education system in Egypt. How is it telling you on your region as Egyptian? If there's this separation, you know, this very crazy.
You'll be surprised to know that, for example, if you are a kid or a child in Britain, you will know more about ancient Egypt than a child in modern Egypt. Because again, but then you would know a lot about Egyptian modern history as a child in Egypt, but as a child in the UK, you would only know about ancient Egypt, but nothing about modern Egypt. Because ancient Egypt became a colonial project. It became a colonial construct. It belongs to all of the world, but not us. It belongs to human human knowledge, or it becomes, it's universal history, but it's not owned. It's not the ownership of the Egyptians. We have no right to claim it as our own. We have to share it with the rest of the world. But interestingly, only when it comes to cases where we have the responsibility to safeguard ancient Egypt for the rest of the world, but we have no rights when it comes to ancient Egypt. So we have equally adopted the very same colonial gaze in our system of education, and that drastically needs to change. And despite that part of our anti-colonial project, when we were fighting for independence from British colonialism, ancient Egypt was at the center of our claim of identity, and it was at the center of our Egyptianhood. But sadly, after independence, there became so much focus on Egyptian military, modern military history, rather than the other multiple layers of Egyptian history. So that's why I was saying that whatever is constructed in museums, be them in the UK or in Egypt, in Africa or in Europe, they do have an implication on how we also see ourselves, not only how others see us, but we see ourselves. We can adopt the very same colonial gaze because we think that this is how we're supposed to be seen, because it comes from what we perceive also as the civilized world. We sadly adopted the very same conception, just like the children in Kenya who would prefer to play with Western toys than with African toys, because this is usually the civilized part of the world where we need to follow, or that it sets the universal standards for everyone. And this is where our own indigenous knowledge and the way we see ourselves and the way we do or be is a forbidden indigenous knowledge, because it can be seen by others as, it is seen by certain parts of the world as uncivilized or not universal as such.
Interesting.
So, do you have any other questions?
No, let's
No?
yeah.
Thank you so much. So now I think it's about time to move for our Q&A, where we open the floor to questions from the public, which my very dear colleague Enu will be assisting us with.
Thank you, Heba. Thank you so much, Lydia, Campbell, and Heba, for such a rich discussion. I know that there are a lot of questions that we already have in the chat. And thank you also, Mihayo, for starting us off with your questions. I think they were really insightful. I want to remind people that if you would like to ask your question with your video, please raise your hand and we'll identify you so that you can ask your question that way. But if you'd prefer to put it in the chat, there's still time to write them in there. So I'll start with the first one. We had a couple of questions about the location of the belongings. And I apologize in advance if I pronounce your name wrong. I'll try my best to say it the way that I think it is. So our first question is from Inke Julius, and they were asking about the location of the belongings. So the first comment is, beautiful description of the Ikidet. Why not use the indigenous word for it? I think naming it Adol deprives it of its pristine nature. Where is it located, in Kenya or Manchester? And then Inke Julius also asked a follow-up question about where the fertility figurine is located as well. How did it get there? Who took it there and how? Restitution, in my opinion, is crucial because of the methods through which these identities were carried to Europe. So maybe we can start there.
Lydia, do you want to take this first?
Okay. So the location of the Ikidets. Okay, we have the ones in the picture, or at least one of two of them. Okay, all the photos are from the National Museums of Kenya, and two of them are part of our collection. Yeah, one of them is part of our collection. One is from a colleague, a gift from, okay, it's on loan for the Dolls of Good Hope exhibition. Then others are photos from Ikidets that are within the country. But that's not to say that there aren't Ikidets in other countries, other museums. Yeah, but this is different from other objects. This is one of our belongings. So these are more common and not necessarily in the sacred domain. Yeah, but directly to the question, these ones are within the country, not in Manchester or in another museum, the ones that are represented within the photos. And I think there's another part of that question which can't quite remember, but yeah, I've answered that part of where they are located.
The other part of the question was, how did the belongings get to where they are? Who took them? And just a statement about how restitution is crucial because of the methods through which identities were carried to Europe.
So I'll say generally, because these ones are in Kenya. So some belongings found their way to Western music. Okay, the more recent ones, some were acquired, maybe even some bought in markets, others as gifts. But in the past, some of them were taken violently during colonial times, when there were like uprisings where, for example, at the coast of Kenya, Lamu, there's kiti cha enzi, a special seat among the Swahili people. So one of them, during an uprising, the British colonialists took the seat to the Europe, and currently it's within the British Museum. So there are such cases. So there are different cases. So some taken by the British colonialists forcefully, others through trickery. So maybe what I had mentioned, they are told that these items are evil, witchcraft, and then they take them with them, and they finally maybe find their ways in museums or kept in personal collections. Then others were given willingly by the community members. Willingly can also be seen in different ways. So yeah, but they were given to these people by the community members. Others were stolen, like the Vigango that I had mentioned, the grave posts. Some of them were seen as art objects, so they're taken from the shrines, and then by people who now sell them to various collectors, and finally some of them would find their ways into museums. So that's one item that's really being pursued by the communities and to be returned because it's sacred. So some of quite a number of them, not quite a number, because many of them out there are been returned, so been restituted to Kenya.
Just to say again, thank you for the question. In short, the figurine is on display in Manchester, with the other items that it was found together with. They were found by Egyptian people, but they were judged by a French inspector of antiquities, and along with thousands of other things, were exported as part of the colonial fines division system. So between the 1880s, particularly, even up to the 1970s, material was exported in that way. There are other belongings like that in Egypt on display, but yeah, a huge amount outside. And I think, although it's illegal now to officially export antiquities from Egypt, it still goes on because the demand has been created. And it's true of cultural heritage generally, but I would say there's something about pharaonic material culture that people outside Egypt especially cannot get enough of. And the demand is there, and people die regularly trying to service the voracious collection habit, the acquisition habit for ancient Egyptian material culture. So the figurine I showed is on display in Manchester, but it came through colonial extraction.
Thank you. I will move on to the next comments. We had some comments about accessibility. Akbar said, not only are the belongings in Western museums, we also have restricted access to the archives. This limitation only to academics is discriminatory, leaving out the general population. And Terence said, I think there is a lot to get from the activities of the missionaries who carried away our sacred cultural heritages and which are not found or not accessible to museums in the Western world. So I don't know if you want to make any comments about that, or I can move on to the next question.
No comment, but to agree. I think not just are we talking about belongings, but the knowledge associated with them has been extracted and is very highly restricted in Western museums today.
Next comment is from Chris. Chris says, those who have interacted with archives in the UK, for example, may be familiar with what Roscoe collected in East Africa, particularly in Uganda. These were expeditions to extract spiritual-related material culture and objectized them as collections. I don't know what for. One wonders what their intention was to accumulate these materials. Some of these collections became permanent loans to these museums, and you wonder whose authority under which they became permanent loans. Don't know if you have any sort of reflections to share there, or I can move on to the next question, which was from Agbo, which says, will the artifacts go to the universities or to the villages? I guess that's kind of in reference to restituting belongings. So maybe you could just share your reflections on that question.
Lydia, is your exhibition traveling around to different institutions? Are they other museums? Will there be?
So currently, it's just in the Nairobi National Museum. If possible, many people are interested in it to travel within the country and also outside. So when we were coming up with this exhibition as alumni, so the idea was if it could travel to the various countries represented within the exhibition, all those who participated. But for now, I would say it's just running at the Nairobi National Museum until the 18th of November. Yes. And then with regards to the question on restitution, there are various views on where the objects could go, various so our belongings, entities, whatever you want to refer to them as. So for some, they say, and also depending on what these items are, for example, sacred objects. So this, for some, there's the idea that they should go to back to the community where they came from. Then there are others, the idea that, like, for example, like national museums, so we keep these items or these belongings on behalf of the community. So we could be a representative or a safe space for these objects to be kept. Then in a country like Kenya, where we have various levels of government, so there are those levels that are closer to the people, so like county. So for us, it's national, so national items of national importance. Then there's the level of county. So for some, they argue that that would be at least closer to where the, depending on where the item came from. So if it's, let's say, like the Vigango from the coast, so a county within the coast area to keep these items or belongings in a, could be a museum setting, a cultural setting, and also access, different types of access. We've talked about access in the West. So traveling to the West can be a challenge because of visas and other things. Then now when they are close to the people, could be like also traveling to where they are and the way they are displayed. So if it's in a museum type setting, also can be a challenge in terms of access, depending on the way that people see it. So they could say maybe it to be put in a different type of setup. So not so much a museum setting, so they could interact with them in a different way from like museum setting where you say don't touch, maybe it's behind the glass and all that. So more in the natural way. And some would want them back to where they were, but depending on where they came from or what they were used for. So like the Vigango, it may not be, you may not be able to return them to the same place. For one, maybe determining where they came from, or now they use you've destroyed the way it was used before. So there'll be various rituals that would need to be conducted, and maybe they wouldn't even accept to return them to the particular place. So there are various issues that relate to restitution, where and how. Yes, many questions.
Thank you for your reflections. We have a raised hand from Mwinji. So I would invite you, if you're able, to please turn on your camera so we could see you as you ask your question. Please go ahead.
Hi, can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, so I just to make my comment that I made in the box briefer, and maybe, but also to add to it. I was just thinking about the comment, especially about how the women's dolls and I suppose artifacts pertaining to women are seen, are kind of like maybe objectifying or degrade, or like, yeah, objectifying towards women. And I would want to think that isn't part of the problem with museums in general, especially those that contain artifacts from outside of the West, that the stories of the people who use the objects or use the objects are never really told within, like, whether it's like, yeah, within the museum space. So for African women, someone will see like maybe like an Afro comb that I used like 15 years ago, like maybe it's 100 years from now, and they'll see the Afro comb, but they won't really know much about, like we were saying, like the context of how I used it, what I thought of the Afro comb, maybe my story. So just thinking like maybe there's also a way to, because what I've also found is that museums are very like, I work sometimes in an art gallery, and what I find the difference to be is that like museums are very just like focused on the objects, but not really on the person or like the subjective or emotive experience of the object. Maybe to start finding ways, like I think you're doing, Lydia, partly with your exhibition, so that people can actually have some kind of context, maybe have some, you know, working with artists to have the object, but also have them make meaning of the object, if it's maybe close to their indigenous, you know, because for some of us it's really weird. Like there's an object in, I think it's the British Museum, which belongs to, it's a crown, it's a Namwanga crown. I'm Namwanga, I'm Zambian, and that's part of my lineage. I'm a Namwanga, I'm a Nakamba. So it's really interesting to see it there, devoid of any context, but knowing, like understanding the gender dynamics of the group, understanding what Namwanga women are like, understanding. So yeah, just like maybe focusing, yeah, less on the object and also on the people. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that comment, those comments. I would totally agree with all of them. And you made a point I wanted to kind of conclude on, which is I found it very useful to work with artists, because that I'm really all about just asking more questions. And artists have helped me, yeah, phrase my questions more helpfully. Thank you.
Thank you. I know we only have a couple of minutes left, so I just wanted to highlight, I think we have about 2 more questions from the chat that I thought would be good to discuss. One is from Khadija, and Khadija says, Lydia, this is a great description of the remembrance doll. Is there an image we can see of this somewhere? Who made this? Lydia, you're muted. So, okay, I think we can.
So the remembrance doll from Namibia, I think it should be in the part of what was shared. I don't know if you can put that up. There was something shared about the dolls of good hope. So some of them are represented within the poster for the exhibition. So I think the Namibian doll, or the Avaherero or Nama doll, was represented within the photos there. So it's one of the ways the people even up to date dress. So it is like the way I was saying with the Turkana, maybe things like material and other things have changed over time, but generally the way the people dress is more or less the same. So even with the Herrero or the Nama doll, it's a representative of even contemporary the contemporary dress style. Yes, so yeah, photo is available within what was sent on the chat. And just trying to refer to what is there and see whether it can be seen. Yeah, so what was sent on the chat, the top left is a representation of the Abaherero and Nama dolls within the website of the National Museums of Kenya, showing the Dolls of Good Hope exhibition. So especially the head scarf is one of the markers of the dress, which I was referring to in relation to the way the people relating to the cattle, the people keep. Yeah, so yes, that is you can see that.
Thank you, Lydia. We'll be sure to share the link. Maybe we can also share it after the talk as well. But thank you. Maybe as concluding thoughts, I wanted to just share a couple of comments that came in about restitution must and should be holistic, and that there's no sort of one-size-fits-all approach. I think the last question that we could end on is from Alexandra Galindo. Alexandra asks, instead of objects or belongings, could entities be an option for referring to those sacred human creations?
As Heba said in her introduction, yeah, objects is very clinical. It's very reductive. So as I said about what we tend to call a fertility figurine, there is definitely something about that which channels divine energy. So something more than human beings. So I think entity might actually be quite good. Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you. I think those are all the questions from the chat. I know we're running out of time, so I apologize if I didn't get to your comment, but I think maybe we can end the public Q&A here, and I'll hand back over to you, Heba. Thank you.
Thank you, Inu, so much. Thank you for all the support you've been offering us throughout, all the lovely visuals we've got, and our visual identity is made by our wonderful Inu. So thank you. And sadly, like all good times, they have to come to an end. So thank you so much, Lydia and Campbell, for being with us, Mihayo, for being with us this evening. And thank you also to all those who have joined us from wherever you were in the world. Thank you. It means a lot to us. This wouldn't have been, an initiative wouldn't have been running without having all of you here with us here. And I would like to remind you that our final talk in this series will be in the 1st of November, which would be Mihayo's artist talk. So please do come along and invite others to come along too. And the final question that we usually end with is that if you find what we're doing interesting, or you would like to share your thoughts with us, please do join our mailing list. You can find it in the QR code here. And have a lovely evening, afternoon, or morning, wherever you are in the world. And thank you so much for joining us here. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.